We can spend a little bit of time on the tabernacle in this hour. An hour is about all it takes to explain everything in connection with the tabernacle. So we'll do that. The first thing I'd like to talk about just for a second is to ask you to turn to page 20 of the paper on the tabernacle that you have hopefully in your notebook or with you, just because this page summarizes the heptamerous sequences that I correlated in this paper between Exodus 25 and Exodus 40. Now Peter has a couple more that he will share with us later on. But what I wanted to do was to just briefly point out this chart to you and some of the things that it reveals. Chapters 25 to 31, if you've read the paper, you may remember, is laid out in 7 sections, each of which are speeches from God. The Lord said to Moses, do this. And on day 2, which is the firmament day, that is the day that they are told that when the host of the people is mustered, they're to pay a shekel tax and become part of the holy army. And that associates the people with the firmament. In chapters 25 to 30, which takes the first long speech of God to Moses and breaks it into 7 sections, the tabernacle itself occupies the day 2 slot, the firmament slot. In chapters 35 to 40, where the tabernacle is, where this is built, and in chapter 40, where the sanctuary is erected, it's the Ark of the Covenant that occupies this firmament slot, for reasons that I think we'll see as we go. Peter will discuss the priests and explain fully why the ephod occupies the second day slot, and the washing of the priest. Well, the washing of the priest, obviously, the baptism of the priest in his anointing, Exodus 29, is with heavenly water. And the implication there is that his washing is part of an association then with the firmament and part of his transfer to this position, identification with the holy place. All the things that happen to him match him up to these holy objects so that he can approach them. And people who have not had these rituals done have not been matched up to those holy objects, and so they'd better stay away. So if we get that far in our conference, I'm sure that Peter will point some of those things out to you. I think the rest of this paper is self-explanatory. I just wanted to point this out. If you look at the rest of this chart, like on day 6, you'll see pretty consistently persons, or those things that symbolize persons, are on day 6 to match up with the day 2 firmament association. Also, it's worth noting, look in the first column down, day 3 is the labor, day 4 is the oil, day 5 is the incense. Look at the third column, day 3 is the table, day 4 is the lamp, day 5 is the incense. In Exodus 40, when they're put up, day 3 is the table, day 4 is the lamp, day 5 is the incense. This is actually in the order of holiness. It's also the order in John's Gospel. Jesus comes and he says he's the bread of life, and he says he's the light of the world in the middle of the Gospel. Then you have this upper room event, and he goes to the altar of incense. In Numbers chapter 4, where the coverings of these items are discussed, and I have this in that Biblical Horizons paper number 2 on degrees of value in the sanctuary, you find that the table is the least holy of the objects in the holy place. And that's signified by the fact that the table is covered with a blue cloth, and then the utensils of the table are put on top of it, and they're covered with a crimson cloth. The utensils are less holy than the table. The next holy object is the lamp, which is entirely wrapped up in a blue cloth with the utensils inside of it. Let me try to diagram these things. Okay, the table of showbread is covered with a blue cloth, and then the utensils are put on top of it, and it's covered with a red cloth. The lampstand, for portage, is covered, and all of its utensils are wrapped up in a blue cloth. The altar of incense, being the most holy object in the room, it's covered with a blue cloth for carrying, and then the utensils of this altar are wrapped separately in a separate blue cloth. And blue is the most expensive of these wool fabrics. because blue is the most expensive dye. We're not used to this because we're used to cheap dyes, but dyes in the ancient world, to produce blue dye, you had to collect a whole bunch of mollusks, and then you had to get this gland out of them and squeeze it, and then you finally get enough to make this blue or deep blue violet dye. And that was the most expensive dye. And the fabric that's dyed is wool. Less expensive is purple, and least expensive is red. The bronze altar is wrapped in purple, is covered with purple, but the fact that this entire thing here, utensils together with it, is wrapped in blue indicates the utensils are holy, but they're not quite holy enough to be wrapped by themselves. Here, the table's covered in blue, and then the utensils are put on it, it's covered in red, which is less expensive. And you say, boy, look at all these details. Well, for some reason, God wants us to think about them, and they're all there. But that ascending order of sanctity is displayed here in the actual text itself. I don't know what that means, but I thought I'd point it out. It's interesting.
What you're talking about just now, is there any significance to the badger or dolphin skin?
I'm afraid to say. I don't want to be accused of not being Presbyterian. I mean, my feelings are hurt. What I concluded is that it's dolphin, apparently, or sea cow, or dugong, not badger. And in Ezekiel it says that God shod Israel with dolphin skin shoes when she came out of Egypt. When, Ezekiel 16, the marriage passage. I shod you with dolphin sandals. It seems to me that these dolphin covers are like shoes, because there's a dolphin leather thing put on top of each one of these that then protects it from the weather because it's leather, but it also seems to have the ceremonial effect of separating it from the world and putting a firmament ocean. It's a sea creature. It puts something of a firmament between these objects and the camp. Since the tabernacle itself is not there around them, this takes the place of it. Yeah, it seems to be a shoe separating it from the unclean. These belong on holy ground, and so you need something to keep them from the ground that's common, the curse prosecuting ground. The Ark of the Covenant is covered several times. If you don't remember this detail, I don't know why anyone would ever have forgotten this from Numbers 4, but if you don't remember it, the Ark is covered first of all with the veil, and then there's a dolphin leather shield put over it, and then there's a pure blue curtain put over it. And whenever the Ark was carried around, this stuff was on it. I mean, you look at Raiders of the Lost Ark and other pictures, it shows these priests carrying around the Ark, and you see the Ark. No, you never saw the Ark. Not even the priests ever saw it. Because, just talking about the tabernacle, the veil hung on 4 posts. They were 15 feet high, 10 cubits, and a cubit is 15 to 20 inches. We'll make them nice short cubits and say it was 15 feet high. And this veil hung down the whole length of it, and these posts were here. The most holy place is, let's say, to my right. And this is a post, stands up here, and had a hook sticking out the back of it. And the veil was hung up on this hook. When it was time to dismantle it and move someplace else, they would unhook it and walk backwards and cover up the ark and never look at it. That should remind you of another story in the Bible. Noah is covered up, and those associations are rather challenging. But then when they would there's some idea of a personage who is glorious and not to be defiled too. But when the tabernacle was set back up, then they would walk this thing in on their shoulders, never put it on a cart, always carry it uplifted as a form of praise. And they would set it down in there with these covers on it, and they would take that blue cover off and fold it up, and they would take the dolphin leather cover up and fold it off, and then there's the veil, and they pull it back off and put it back up and never look at it. And there was no light in the Holy of Holies. It's pitch dark in there. There's no window in there. And the candelabra doesn't shed light in there because of the veil. So when the high priest went in once a year, he didn't really see much of what he was doing either. It was shrouded in thick darkness. But that's how this veil gets on here. So this is really covered up. And I'm not for sure about this, but probably when the ark was captured by the Philistines, they took it into Dagon's temple and then uncovered it. And that's when Dagon fell down. And as R.C. Sproul says, they came in the next day and they said, doggone. They probably covered it back up again. When the ark got to Beth Shemesh, we're told that people looked inside of it. It probably means they pulled the curtains up. I don't know that it means they opened the lid. They may have done that too. But they pulled those curtains up for sure and looked at it, and they were killed. That happens in the Raiders of the Lost Ark too, when they take the lid off. Cherubim come and kill them. Great stuff. I want to just briefly survey the tabernacle, and you can't say everything about it, obviously. The things that I'm interested in presenting, and I'll try to follow this theme up, talking about the temple and Ezekiel's temple, is something of the heavenly structure of it. Basically, there are two courts. As you know, you've got the actual court, which is 100 cubits by 50 cubits, and it's divided basically into the outer half with the altar in the middle, and the back half with the ark smack dab in the middle of it, and then the holy place leading as a ladder to heaven in between these two things, the mountaintop, and then the water here, the laver, and then the rest of the ladder to heaven, and then the throne of God. So you actually have this ladder to heaven operating when you look at it. Now, let's talk first of all about the court. In order to come into this courtyard here, through this door, you had to be clean. The priests were supposed to distinguish between the clean and the unclean, and between the holy and the common. That's in Leviticus 10. Priest is to distinguish between, let's see, where is it? Leviticus 10, verse 10. You are to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, and between the unclean and the clean. Well, the holy and the profane basically is a distinction between Israel and the Gentiles on the one hand. It's also a distinction between God and the people. The clean and the unclean is a distinction within Israel. Now, the Israelites had the right to come into the courtyard here. They could go up on the north side, and there was a table here. If they wanted to sacrifice a lamb or a goat, they'd heave that thing up on the table and sacrifice it. If they wanted to sacrifice a bull, they did that somewhere out in here. A bull's a little bit heavy to put up on a table, so they did that on the ground. You could come in here if you were clean, but if you were unclean, if you had an issue, or somebody fed you some pizza and you ate some pork pepperoni or something, you couldn't come in here till you were cleansed. If you just had a baby, you couldn't come in till a certain number of days were up. So you had to be clean to come in here, and this is clean space. Now, the tabernacle itself, which we will see is a second story on this structure, is holy space. That's holy ground. And I'm sure Peter will point out to you that the high priests don't have any shoes. The garments of the high priest, nothing said about shoes because they were on holy ground, and you take your shoes off on holy ground. They went around barefoot in there, at least from what I can tell. If that's not true, I'm sure it'll get corrected in Peter's lecture, but it is true, isn't it? Yes, but I think that's what everybody agrees with. Now, this tabernacle, it's interesting, and almost all of these things in the tabernacle and temple are described in architectural terms or furniture terms, but they're also biological terms. And we use them when we talk about the feet of a chair. And sometimes, you know, a chair is made with little lion feet or something on it. But we use the word foot. Well, when the Bible describes these various things, they have feet and shoulders and hands and all this other stuff. And part of the reason for that is that all of these different things represent people. And I think that's why in Hebrew that it's human body language that's used to describe the architectural and furniture features of these items here, because they signify people. The tabernacle has shoulders. This courtyard, rather, has shoulders. And that's significant for what I want to point out. The shoulders are mentioned in Exodus 27, 14, and 15. It says, the hangings on one side of the gate will be 15 cubits with their 3 pillars and their 3 sockets. And on the other shoulder, well, this is actually, I misread that. The hangings on one shoulder of the gate shall be 15 cubits with their 3 pillars and their 3 sockets. And on the other shoulder shall be hangings of 15 cubits with their 3 pillars and their 3 sockets. Now what this means is, this gateway into the tabernacle courtyard, this environment here was white shrouds held up by pillars. And these pillars were here, set in sockets Then there was this blue gateway into it, blue curtain hanging here. And the sides of this were called shoulders. Now, shoulders hold things up. And these pillars are actually held up. And attention is called to the fact that the pillars are held up off the ground in chapter 27, verse 17. All the pillars of the court shall be furnished with silver bands with their hooks of silver and sockets of bronze. Now, this is what these pillars look like. They were probably like tree trunks, fairly big. They came down here in the bottom, and they had probably a square peg coming down out of the bottom of them, which fit into a socket with a square hole in it. And this was bronze. Up at the top, it had a band of silver and a hook of some sort, probably like this, that probably held a pole on which these curtains were hung. And we're not told all those details. You have to know something about hangings, because we're not told all the details. What we are told about, and emphasis is given to, is the socket or base of bronze and the top of it being silver. Now, Poitras suggests, I think he's right, that this puts it up off the ground. The bronze represents the earth, and this pillar is held up off the ground. And so what is hung between the pillars is off the ground. And up at the top is silver, and we're going to find out that the tabernacle itself is set in sockets of silver that go up, which implies that the tabernacle is stacked on top of the court. Now remember, when we get to the temple, we'll have a series of stair steps leading up between these environments. And Ezekiel's temple has a whole series of stair steps leading up. But when you're building a tent on the ground, you can't have stair steps. So how do you communicate the idea of stories and moving upwards? But you've got to do it in some symbolic fashion. And one of the ways that you do it, and I think he's right, is by means of this. So the pillars have got these bronze sockets, and they're stationed around, and in between them are white linen curtains. Chapter 27, verse 9. Chapter 27, verse 9 of Exodus, you shall make the court of the dwelling place. On the south side there will be hangings for the court of fine twisted linen, 100 cubits long for one side, and its pillars will be 20 with 20 sockets of bronze. The hooks and pillars and bands shall be of silver. Likewise for the north side there shall be hangings 100 cubits long, and its 20 pillars and sockets of bronze and hooks of silver and all that. So, except for this blue entryway here, all the rest of this was white. It was white, held off the ground. And when you came into this environment, you move into an environment where there are these kind of billowing white curtains all around you held off the ground. And you know that, since they're off the bronze and they're held up, you're in a cloud, basically. I think this represents being in a cloud. Now, that is my suggestion, which I think begins to make more sense when you look at some of the other features of it. This blue veil that you enter through then represents the sky. When you look up at the sky, you see clouds, you see blue. They're both here, and you're moving into this blue environment where you're surrounded by clouds. Basically, you're up in the air. Remember, I mentioned earlier that in Numbers, the people are dressed as angels. They have wings. The word kanaf, or wing, is the word that's used for the corner of the garment. And a great deal of attention is paid to that wing of the garment. David cuts off Saul's wing. And every time the woman lays hold of the wing of Jesus' garment, the corner of his garment is not right. Wing is the word that's used. And these were like angels here, flying around. Anybody who comes in here. But that's the image that's used. So, I think this consistent image, you're in atmospheric heavens in this environment. One other point to make, because this would be a question. If you built one of these environments, you would naturally put your pillars in a socket. I mean, this is just common sense. And so the question is, why do I put so much weight? Why does Poitras put weight in the fact that this is a bronze socket and you've set this post down inside of it? After all, if you're going to build something like this out in the desert, you're not going to pound them in the ground to make a wall. You're going to set them in sockets and connect them with rods so they don't move. Common sense tells you that. Well, the reason that we attach weight to this information is that there's a lot of details about how this would be built that are not in the Bible. And so you have to ask the question, why is attention called to this fact when other aspects of how this would have been constructed are not included? As we'll see in just a minute, there are a lot of questions as to what the tabernacle itself looked like. because we're not given enough information to figure it out for sure. We have to guess. So the question is, why are some things mentioned? And the answer is, the things that are mentioned are the things we're supposed to reflect upon that have theological weight. The things that are not mentioned are not important. We don't have to reflect on them. God doesn't want us building one of these, except, as an object lesson or something. Moses went up on the mountain and was shown a lot of things. He came down the mountain and said, now look, this is what I saw. I said to Bezalel and the Holiab, this is what I saw, so I'll make it look like this. God dictated certain things for Moses to write down, and that's the Word, but Moses was also shown how some things looked. Many times it says God showed him this, God showed him that. Well, the things that were shown, like what the laver looked like, how big it was, how tall it was, we don't know. We don't know what the laver looked like. It's almost certainly round, but some people have drawn it as octagonal or hexagonal. We don't know. But Moses knew because he was shown it. Well, we're given certain things here, and we deal with the text. See, the Word of God is what we're dealing with. So the Word stresses these bronze sockets, and so Poythress, I think, is right to make something of it. And we wouldn't make a theological reflection on something that's not mentioned in the text, but we do on the things that are. Now, let me talk about the altar and the laver just a little bit. Let me try to draw this another way. Here we have these posts set in these sockets, creating this environment. And here is the altar, and then here is the laver. And we have these posts in these sockets with these curtains in between, white curtains. And I've just drawn these in on the same platform or level. Well, the altar is not put on a bronze pedestal. So the altar is sitting on what? On the ground. But it pokes up into these clouds. The altar sits on the ground, but the top of it, you see, symbolically speaking, it pokes up into these clouds. Now, we're at Mount Sinai at the moment, and right in front of us is a mountain that pokes up into a cloud. God's cloud is up there. Ezekiel speaks of his altar, and he calls it Har El, Mountain of God. So we know that the altar represents the holy mountain, and here it is symbolically laid out. The altar pokes up into the clouds. The laver, however, is different. The laver, we're explicitly told, is set on a pedestal. And I didn't write down the verse there, so maybe I should go ahead and try to find it real quick. I'm not gonna, though. But just believe me. Or if you want to read more about the laver, I have a paper out there called Chariots of Water that goes into a lot of it. But the laver is put on a pedestal of bronze. Well, now you see, then this laver is up in the atmosphere. But in terms of symbolism here, the laver is at the same level as these clouds, and of course it has water in it. And this water then is at this surface level. Now, what I will suggest to you is the laver being positioned between the doorway of the tabernacle and the altar. And the fact that you've got to wash in this laver before you're allowed to go into the tabernacle, and the fact that the laver is off the ground, one step up, means that the water in this is equivalent to the blue veil that leads into the tabernacle. So we're off the ground, we're in the sky, with the clouds, and where there's some water, there's the laver then. The mountain has come up underneath us, and we go up to the top of the mountain, so to speak, and then here's this laver. And the top of the laver, the surface of the laver, then, is equivalent to the doorway into the firmament heavens, the next room in these firmament heavens, the back room, as we said last time. Now, I want to just say a little bit more about the laver in case we don't get back to it. And essentially this information is in that paper, Chariots of Water. But in the temple is not just a laver. In the temple, there are two different places where things are washed. 2 Chronicles 6:13 replaces the laver with two other things. 2 Chronicles 6:13. Oh no, that's not what I want yet. The first verse I want is something about the laver. Solomon made a bronze laver 5 cubits long, 5 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high, and set it in the midst of the court, and on it he knelt on his knees in the presence of the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands toward heaven, and dedicated the temple. And what we're told here is Solomon built a laver. Now, your Bible may say platform, but it's the word for laver here in this verse. He builds a laver, and obviously he's got some type of surface on the top of it, and he gets on top of that to kneel to pray the prayer. Well, again, this is setting up a heavenly environment. And since he's in the courtyard when he does it, it puts Solomon as close as he can get to the holy place. Because he can't go in there, but he can get right up here to the veil and then address God there. So again, I think the idea of the laver as part of the doorway is there. But in the temple, 2 Chronicles 4:6, we're told that Hiram, not of Tyre, made 10 basins in which to wash, and he set 5 on the right side and 5 on the left to rinse things for the ascension offering, but the bronze sea was for the priest to wash in. Now, in the temple, there are these 10 water stands that are made like chariots that have water in them, and they're lined up in front of the door of the temple like this. There's 5 of them on each side. They are lined up in front of the shoulders of the temple, and the shoulders are the sides of the temple itself. And then over here is the bronze sea. The priests wash in the bronze sea. The sacrifices are washed in these lavers, which form a ladder to heaven, and they're huge. They cannot be wheeled anywhere, but they have these symbolic wheels on them, as if they were chariots going back and forth between heaven and earth and carrying this water to wash things. Now the question is, how come the priests were washed in the bronze sea and the sacrifices are washed in these water stands? What's the difference? Well, essentially, I think the difference is this. See if you can understand the architecture here. You tell me. The bronze sea rested on the back of 12 cows, rested on the back of 12 bulls, and it had a row of gourds around the middle of it, and it had a lip here that was made like a lily. Now this lily lip is equivalent to the most holy place. That's what we see. These bronze cows or bulls represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and the bronze sea is set on top of them. So this is equivalent to the laver sitting on its pedestal in the old tabernacle. And so what it does is it ushers the priest into, the priest washes in this. That means he can go into the holy place, or he can go up to the top of the altar. That gets him that far. Now the water stands are a little bit different. The water stands rest on bronze legs, called shoulders, but inside of the stand is a pedestal made of bronze, and then you have the bowl of water in it. So it's a 3-story figure. And so these legs get you up to a higher pedestal, and this pedestal is not at the level of the court or the ground. This pedestal is actually resting here symbolically. You see, it's moved up to a higher story, which means that the laver that's inside this chariot is equivalent to the veil. Do you see what I'm saying? This is like those bronze posts out here. This carries you up to this level here, and then just as the golden altar and other things sitting on the tabernacle floor are actually on the 2nd story, this pedestal is in the 2nd story, and so it holds up water that's higher, and that water represents the veil. Now the difference between the priest and the sacrifices is this. The priest can only go into the holy place, but the smoke of the sacrifices ascends all the way into heaven. And as the smoke of the sacrifice ascends off the altar, it goes up here and is joined with the smoke of the altar of incense and then goes into God's presence. And so what that communicates then is that there's the sacrifice, which represents Jesus and points beyond these Aaronic priests to something that they don't get to do. It points all the way to the highest heaven. And I think that's laid out in this architectural structuring that's there in these lavers. Well, that much on the laver. Now let's talk about the tabernacle itself. This is where it introduced some other considerations, but essentially I think that we've anticipated a lot of this. The tabernacle is built with a tent over it, and then it consists of golden boards, wood with gold overlaid them, 1.5 cubits wide, so they're fairly wide. And each of those boards have 2 hands on them down at the bottom. They're called hands, and they're stuck in sockets of silver. So the boards of the tabernacle look basically like this. They're gold. Then they have these 2 hands sticking out the bottom, and those 2 hands, each one goes into a socket of silver. And they're just lined up. This is how you would make a tent in the ancient world. In the ancient world, people lived in tents. They didn't live in teepees and wigwams. They would lay some type of metal piece or stones along the ground with holes in them, and they would make walls. And you could have a tent with 20 or 30, and you could have several rooms in the tent. And that's how this one is. But these are laid up right next to each other, one after another, with these sockets of silver. Now, as I suggested in following Poitras, these sockets are actually stacked on top of the silver bands, and so we're in the second story. Now, that forms a wall that's open on one end where the outer veil is going to be, and over it, or somehow connected with it, is a curtain of blue with cherubim on it, and then over all of that is a tent, an outer tent. And this tent is made of goat's hair, and I think it represents the glory cloud. It's dark. God dwells in thick darkness. When Ezekiel sees this cloud, and he sees inside of it, he sees the cherubim guarding the throne of God. He seems to see the glorious, shiny colors of electrum. Electrum is a combination of gold and silver, and this tabernacle is a combination of gold and silver. And the feet of the cherubim are bronze, and that's what they set on the ground. But all of that is behind a cloud, a thick, dark cloud. And so this tent over the tabernacle is a cloud. Now here's the question. In the paper that I wrote on From Glory to Glory, Degrees of Value in the Sanctuary, and most of the literature that you see on the tabernacle, this tent is conceived to be more or less like this. You've got these walls, these golden walls of the tabernacle, and you have this blue cherubim thing over it, and then you have the tent over it like this. Just basically square. Flat roof, hanging down the sides. Now the problem with that is that nobody would ever make a tent like that, because if it rains a few times, it rots. And so it is probably more likely, Augustus Strong, who wrote Strong's Concordance, Strong's for the strong, Young's for the young, Cruden's for the crude. He suggests, just a regular tent, pitched tent with several peaks in it, according to however, and what you would see is this tent, and then inside of it is the tabernacle itself. But this would have slope roofs the way a regular tent would, made out of goat's hair, which would make it look more like clouds than this plain square formation. I'm more inclined to that now as a result of thinking about the sheer practicality of it, but I don't know for sure. And I haven't read anything that involved a great debate back and forth where somebody really found out the key to settling it. What we do know is that there's this outer shell of goat's hair, which would be relatively dark, if not black, and I think represents the glory cloud. When you get inside of it, you find this wall. Golden wall with sockets of silver, which I've already discussed, and the information there is in chapter 26, 15 to 19. Let me just glance at that and make sure there wasn't something I wanted to read. I don't think there is. Yeah, it's just there. Chapter 26, 15 to 19 of Exodus describes this wall and the fact that it was set in sockets of silver. Now we have the hangings with the cherubim on them that are in the tabernacle. And this is another place where there's two possibilities. Most commentators, and I in the past, have always assumed that, well, let me just read the passage and then that'll get the information before us. Chapter 26 of Exodus, verses 1 to 6, describes the curtains of the tabernacle. You will make the tabernacle with 10 curtains of fine twisted linen and blue and purple and scarlet stuff, or wool. Now this combination of linen and wool is priestly. The Israelite citizen was not allowed to wear a mixture of wool and linen, but the priest did, and the tabernacle was. The order in which these things are listed is the order of the quantity of material, from what we can tell. So the warp was linen and the woof was blue and purple and scarlet. We don't know how they were woven together, but there was more blue than purple and more purple than scarlet. But you get this rainbow configuration and probably a flaming configuration. I think that this is the true fiery furnace. Among other things, the tabernacle is a fiery furnace, and the fire in there causes all of these bronze things to glow and shine, which Moses shines when he comes down off the mountain. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians that we are like gold and silver, that we get exposed to God's fire, we start to shine and glow, whereas the wicked are like wood and they burn up. And Klein talks about the flame aspect of this, that it represents a fiery furnace where God is a consuming fire and we all start to glow and shine from being in His presence, and that's why these things are made of metal. Metal is just hard dirt. We're made of dirt, and hard dirt are stones, and real hard stones are metal. And metal shines when it gets in the fire. So I think that's legitimate imagery, but it's also rainbow, and it's also these rich colors here. It says in this last part of this verse, you will make these curtains with cherubim. So they're cherubim woven into them. The length of each curtain will be 28 cubits, and the width of each curtain 4 cubits. All the curtains will have the same measurement. 5 curtains will be joined to one another, and the other 5 curtains will be joined to one another. And you will make loops of blue on the edge of the outermost curtain in the first set, and likewise you will make on the edge of the curtain that's outermost in the second set, and you will make loops and you'll hook them together. Now, how are these things done? We have a curtain here that's 28 cubits long by, what is it? 4, isn't it? Yeah, right, 4. Now, you got to hook them together in groups of 5. Where do you hook them? Usually, it's said that you hook them side to side. So this is what you get as a big curtain that has a dimension 28 by 20. And then the two of them are hooked together, and they're laid over these wooden walls. Here are the walls, curtains laid over them like this, and then right over the veil is where these two curtains are hooked together. And the one hangs over the front part of the tent and the one over the back. Now, they're not actually going to hang over it. They're going to hang on the inside of it by some attachment that we don't know. But when you're inside the tabernacle and you look up, you see cherubim. You look at the walls, you see cherubim. You don't actually see the golden walls because they're hidden from view by these curtains, but that's what you see. And in the most holy place where God is, God looks up, and God looks to the side, and he sees these cherubim curtains on all sides. That's one view. Strong suggests otherwise. And he's got a good case. He suggests that they're joined end to end to make 2 long strips that are hung along the wall, like this. Here's the tabernacle, walls. Got to make this 10 by 30, holy place and most holy place. That's not exactly the scale. You take these 28-foot curtains and you connect them 5 each, and you get 5 times 8 is 40, 2 5s are 10, you get 140. Now, this is 30 plus 10 plus 30 is 70. Now, start your strip of cherubim right here, and run it all the way around the wall, and run it all the way around the outside. And you have cherubim all along the wall. And then, since it's only 4 cubits wide and you've got a 10-cubit span, you've got room for another one stacked up. Kind of a second story of cherubim all along the wall and the outside, facing out and facing in. Now, that's what was on the walls of the temple. In Solomon's temple and Ezekiel's temple, when you went inside the temple, that's what you saw. They had frescoed or carved on the wall cherubim or cherubim and palm trees alternating, just standing up. Cherubim standing like this all along the wall as ranks of guards around the throne. Well, you see, this would be the same. If Strong is right, then that's how these curtains were arranged. And when you went inside the tabernacle, instead of seeing miscellaneous cherubim in all different kinds of positions, some upside down, some right side up, because the curtain's going to go like this. So you'd have to either sew them very carefully so that they matched, or else they would be many different directions. Instead of seeing that, what you see are these ranks of cherubim guardians all around. Now, which do you prefer? Take your pick. I like this suggestion. I'd never thought of it before until I began to study this up again, that actually that's how these curtains were done. There were hangings on the wall. In that case, you would see the gold at the floor and in the middle and at the top. You'd have bands of gold where you'd see these gold overlaid on wood walls, and then there'd be these bands of cherubim, 2 ranks of them on all the walls, and on the outside facing out all the way around. So now you come under this tent. You've got this elaborate tent with peaked roof, and you're an Israelite, and you kind of peek in there, and what do you see? You see these cherubim facing out on you at every side. You can't really go in any closer than that, but that's what you would see. And the priest, he goes in, and he goes in, there's cherubim all around, standing in these rows. The other advantage to Strong's suggestion is it leaves the tent open, and you've got this problem in that you've got this altar of incense here putting incense up is just going to go up and has no place to go because your ceiling is covered. On Strong's suggestion, the tabernacle is actually open, but there's this tent over it, and that would give room for the smoke to go on out and find its way out more readily than just going up to the ceiling and stopping and having no place to go. And here again, in the temple has windows around the top, so the smoke could escape, and the smoke from the lampstands, there are 10 lampstands in the temple, that smoke can escape. The tabernacle, on the traditional understanding, is real closed in. There are no windows. There's no place for the smoke to go. There's no place for the smoke from the candelabra to go. But on Strong's suggestion, it's open at the top, and all this stuff would kind of go out into the tent area and find its way out. So it's an attractive suggestion, and because of the analogy to the way the temple was made, I find it very compelling, but it's new to me. I don't think we have to settle it. If you ever find anything that settles it one way or the other, I'd like to see it. What I think we can say is that we're surrounded by cherubim. God is, and of course they have to do with guarding, and they're keeping us away at the moment because Jesus hasn't come yet. The ground of this place is up on the second level, and therefore is the floor of heaven. It's holy ground. If the priests wore shoes out in the courtyard, they took them off when they went inside the sanctuary, because they would be coming onto holy ground. And the items that are on the floor, let's draw a picture again now. We have this second story up here, which is the floor of the holy place, and we've got these walls here. But we won't draw the walls. We have the lampstand, which is like an almond tree growing up. It's sitting on the floor. We have the altar of incense, which is growing up, and it sits on the floor. And we have this table here, and it sits on the floor. So these things aren't lifted up in the idea of being in a higher position. They are positioned in the firmament heavens. And this creates God's living room. You've got a potpourri in there to make the room smell good. You've got the food in there, and you've got a light in there. And it's the priest's job to maintain the living room every day. Every day he goes in the morning, trims the lamps. I think this lamp burned day and night because there was no window in there. There was no light. So the light was not put out in the morning and then lit again at night. It was just trimmed in the morning, and it went all day. Every day in the morning he does the incense in the lamp, and in the evening he does them again. And other than that, he never had to go in there. And the priest didn't go in here all the time. They almost never went in here. Twice a day, the priest went into the holy place. In the morning, as the sun was coming up, probably right after the morning sacrifice, he went in, did the incense and did the lamp, and went out. And he had no reason to go back in for the whole rest of the day. At night, the evening sacrifice, goes in, gets the lamp going, does the incense, and goes back out. It's not his house. He's just a servant. Once a week, he changes out the bread. If one of the priests commits a sin, well, I guess it's only if the high priest commits a sin, he would have to take blood in and put it on the horns of the golden altar. Otherwise, they never went in to put blood on that altar. So they almost never went in here. You know, it's not like they were constantly going in and out. Just went in twice a day and then once a week to switch out the showbread. Now behind this we have the veil, which obviously is a boundary into the highest heaven where the throne of God is. Now let's discuss the throne of God, which is the ark. Back to our platform. We've got this platform here, which is the bottom floor of heaven. And we've got the table on it, and we've got the altar of incense on it, and we've got the lampstand on it, and we've got the Ark of the Covenant on it. And they're all on the same level. Well, the ark is behind the veil, but it's not up on a pedestal or anything. It's still on this same level. So it's in the holy place. But now on top of it is the cover, which is a separate item. The cover with the cherub. And the cherub are beaten in and made part of the cover. This is all one thing. And we know that... Oh. Yeah. Oh, it's okay. I'm taking it here too. That's for your comments. We didn't need that comment. This is all one piece here. And we know that God is enthroned above the cherub. So now, this is the most holy place. Behind the veil is the throne of God, which is the most holy place. And the throne of God consists of this odd box, commandments in it. That's all that's in there. It's just the Ten Commandments. The 2 tablets of it. That's in there, and that's in the firmament heavens. It's on the same level. The silver floor. It's on the same level. Then above it is this slab. And above the slab is God. So what does this slab correspond to? What does the mercy seat correspond to?
That curtain.
This one, the veil. Okay, so we've got both the forward-looking motif of going behind the veil and also the upward motif of above the cherubim. Remember that when the cherubim appear in Ezekiel chapter 1, over their heads and over their wings is a firmament. So basically, the final firmament. Basically, this mercy seat here is equivalent to the veil. And God is enthroned above it. And His feet are on the mercy seat. It is called His footstool. And Jesus, it says, Melchizedek is enthroned until His enemies are made His footstool. Now what does that mean? Everything I've said so far is that the veil is the church. And if the veil is the footstool, and if the mercy seat is the footstool, then when it says He makes His enemies a footstool for His feet, is that a picture of God trampling on the wicked, or is it a picture of God converting the righteous and turning them into a mercy seat? Well, I think it has to be the latter. Making His enemies into His footstool is a way of saying convert His enemies. It's not a way of saying destroy His enemies, except that we're destroyed and born again. I want to prove that to you in Hebrews chapter 10. I'm personally convinced of this, but I think Hebrews 10, 11 to 18 makes it clear that the formation of the footstool, the making of enemies into a footstool, is an image of conversion and salvation and the formation of the church. The church then becomes this mediating boundary between heaven and earth. The church has this mediatorial function in Christ. Verse 11 of Hebrews 10, every priest stands daily ministering and offering time after time the same old sacrifices which can never take away sin. But He, Jesus, having offered one sacrifice for sins, once and for all, sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time onward until His enemies be made a footstool to His feet. It's a quotation, of course, from Psalm 110 about Melchizedek. For by one offering He has perfected for all time those who are sanctified. See that? He's waiting until His enemies are made a footstool for His feet, and then it's explained because He has sanctified some people. It doesn't say waiting until His enemies are made a footstool for His feet, for He will eventually trample them all underfoot and squash them. That's not the way it's written. It seems to be pointing toward the conversion and formation of the church as a footstool. This was a new thought to me the first time I came across it. Maybe it's old hat to some of you, but because it's new to me, I'm going to share it. Verse 15, as typical of the writer of Hebrews, he's always quoting one passage after another to back up his point. Verse 15, the Holy Spirit also bears witness to us, for after saying, this is the covenant I will make with them after those days, says the Lord, I will put my laws on their heart, and upon their mind I will write them. He then says, their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Now where there is forgiveness of these things, there is no longer any offering for sin. The offering for sin makes the footstool. The offering of sin puts the law on the heart. So all of this comes to life here. The law here in the ark is made a more lively thing. What it symbolizes comes to pass, and we become the footstool. In other words, God is enthroned on us. We hold Him up. Above our heads is the throne. That's what worship is. He is enthroned upon the praises of Israel. And so that, I think, is what the footstool is. Peter pointed this out in the last Biblical Arisings. His article gave all the information on this. The footstool is not the ark. The footstool is the mercy seat. And it is a positive image. The formation of that footstool is a picture of the formation of the church. Now that is all I had planned to do in the way of expounding the tabernacle as degrees of heaven.
Do you recall the reference where the ark is called the footstool? Samuel?
It's First Chronicles.
Where the mean the ark itself at first is called the footstool.
I don't think the ark is called. The cover of the ark.
The cover is called. Is there a place where
There's a place in, I don't remember the exact reference, First Chronicles somewhere where the articles of the tabernacle are described and listed, and the ark and the footstool are two separate items. In fact, it says that the temple is to be made for the ark and for its footstool. Something like that.
I'm thinking it's in chapter 28, but I'm not.
Did the Psalms ever refer to it that way? I would expect it might get down there.
No,
there's not that
the
much.
Psalms don't designate what the footstool is. It talks about worshiping at the footstool, but it doesn't say what the footstool is.
How does that tie into Jesus? I believe it's in Sermon on the Mount. It talks about not swearing the temple, which is something in the earth, which is his footstool. Do you know the passage?
Yeah, I know the passage, but I'm not finding it. Oh,
22.
yeah. First Chronicles 22.
28
First Chronicles 28, verse 2. Okay, that's the verse we were talking about a moment ago. And then this one in Matthew 5, I make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by the earth, for it's the footstool of his feet, or for Jerusalem, it's the city of the great king. Well, you're the author of the essay on the footstool.
Well, that First Chronicles 28 passage, I don't have the Hebrew reads there, but it could be that, appositional, where it says, I had my heart to build a house, a place of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, for the footstool, it would be even the footstool. Good enough?
No, it's distinguished. There's two separate objects. Very good. The preposition is repeated from the Hebrew for the ark and for the footstool.
Oh, there's two distinct reasons.
Did you deal with Matthew 5?
No, I remember that I mentioned something about in connection with the Day of Atonement, the object of the sprinkling of blood on the Day of Atonement is not the ark, but specifically says the caporet, the covering. And I just suggested that is either an image of cleansing of Israel as its or maybe cleansing of the world because the world is.
Yeah, my guess would be, in terms of what we've seen so far, that what it means is that the earth is covered by this firmament, and everything below the throne of God is, so to speak, the earth. And from our point of view, firmament is part of heaven, but from God's point of view, the firmament is part of the earth. And so his feet rest on it. And when you cleanse the earth, you put water on the firmament because that has the effect of cleansing everything underneath it. Is there aught else? What do you think? Were those curtains hanging along the wall horizontally, or were they...
That's the way you do drywall. You put it on walls, you put it lengthwise.
I don't know if I'm visualizing this correctly, but does that leave the most holy place open so that there would be some light in the most holy place, contrary to what you said earlier?
Well, I guess there might be some light creeping through, but the whole thing was covered by a tent, and then over the tent was a red ram skin, and over that was a dolphin leather, so it was probably pretty dark. But there might have been some light creeping through.
Yeah, as I understand what you're saying is that the tent would have been somewhat, it's not directly
somewhat
on
open.
top of the walls, but higher.
Yeah. Yeah, Strong makes the point that you just wouldn't, I can't draw a flip, but you wouldn't really have a flat roof tent because it would rot. You're going to have some poles and you're going to have slopes, in which case there might have been light creeping through. Although Strong in his book, he talks about how the tent curtains are sewed together, the goat hair curtains, and he makes them out to be pretty seamless and going down pretty far. So the light would have to come kind of up from underneath and be reflected and get in. Probably wouldn't be much. Not that I'm dying to defend,
What book are you talking about?
It's called The Tabernacle of Israel by Augustus Strong. It was reprinted by Kriegel a couple of years ago. That's the most challenging thing in it to me. Yes, that's different from what you read everywhere else, but it does correspond to the way the temple is built. There are in your notebook one architectural realization of the temple that shows kind of these palm trees and cherubim all along the walls, and we don't know exactly what they look like, of course, but they were there. And it makes the tabernacle much more like the temple to do it that way. Doesn't make it right, though. It could have been different.
Well, theologically speaking, is there any There's no difference in the
I don't think there's really any difference in the imagery.
practice. It's about one group.
Yeah. You wind up with a cloud around the tent either way. You wind up with cherubim guarding it all either way. And you wind up with these multicolored rainbow-like things around either way. The only real advantage to Strong's point is that you've got these gold-plated walls, and on the traditional interpretation, they're invisible because the curtain hangs in front of them completely. Or if you were to say the curtain hung outside of them, then you wouldn't see the cherubim. But on Strong's interpretation, you've got these two bands of cherubim, and you would see the gold in between, so you would actually get the entire effect on the inside.
Oh, so the gold wouldn't show through.
Yeah, because the curtains are only 4 cubits long. You've got 10 here, and you've got 4 here and 4 here. Well, maybe wider than that, but you'd have space in between.
About 6 inches.
Yeah. And you'd actually have 2 stories implied here as well. Which, since you have 2 stories in the tabernacle, that helps too in some ways.
Your whole 7-day pattern, 1st and 4th and 7th, with light, representative of God and all that, and yet He dwells in darkness in the Holy of Holies.
I think the thick darkness there is because we're sinners, and when the cloud moves between the Egyptians and the Israelites, it's dark on their side. And so the darkness of the cloud, I think, has to do with God's manifestation to us, not what He is in Himself.
So when we see Him, it's darkness because of our sin?
Yeah, He's shrouded because of our sin. If we saw Him face to face, we'd be toast.
And also your curtains, your outer courtyard of the tabernacle, the white curtains, cloud effect and all that.
Yeah.
Are those loose curtains? Are these drawn tight? You can't see through them? Or,
Oh, I think they were hooked at the bottom as well as the top, or they would have billowed a little bit. There was nothing in there that people couldn't look at.
So people could stand around
the edge of a pillar and kind of glance through where the curtains were loose or something.
Are you going to do anything with the plumbing of the tabernacle?
There was no need for it.
The blood?
Almost no blood was taken inside the tabernacle. A little bit was sprinkled in there from time to time in the altar.
No, how about the courtyard? Are they killing all the animals and the blood, and what are they doing with all the blood?
Well, it's taken out to various places outside the camp. You take the fat ashes out to a clean place. The blood is just kind of burned up and dries off.
Edersheim says that during Passover, Jesus had built troughs, and then they ran it off into the brook Kidron because there's 250,000 lambs slaughtered.
The altar in the tabernacle was built like this. I think there's a picture in your notebook, but it was hollow and had this grating inside of it. But the altars of Solomon, we're not told this for certain, but the altar of Ezekiel was built as a stepped pyramid that went down and had a trench around it. And it had 3 sections. This is called the heart. This middle section is called the mountain of God. And then it had this lower section and this trough, which in true new eyes I associated with the Gehenna at the bottom of Jerusalem. And I think that they probably got the idea of much blood being spilled and then blood running off in this trough underneath from that, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think Edersheim points out that during Passover, you would have all that blood, and it would just fill up that Kidron Valley as it was running off out the temple wall into Gehenna.
Yeah.
Because there was so much that
Must have stung.
had to stink it. When Jesus walked over to Gethsemane, he had to step right over that stuff to get come through.
Well, there was a bridge over there.
Well, a bridge, I guess, but then he just had a river of blood.
Yes.
That raises one more question. Some representations you see an ash pit within the outer wall.
Yeah, Wenham draws it that way, and I've never been quite sure
that's
why,
right.
because
In numbers.
I think that the ash pit was outside, but I'm not sure. It could have been a typographical error, but I don't remember what he says. Well, guys, that's great. We'll stop.